The morning mist clung to the mountain slopes like ghostly fingers, and through that grey veil came the sound that would haunt the valley forever. Not the gentle rustle of wind through pine trees, not the distant call of mountain birds, but something far more ominous. The rhythmic thunder of thousands upon thousands of marching feet, the clatter of armor, the snorting of war horses, and the deep rumble of an army so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon itself. In the narrow confines of a mountain pass, barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand shoulder to shoulder, 3,000 warriors prepared to face an enemy force that outnumbered them 20 to 1. These were not fresh recruits or untested militia. These were hardened veterans who had looked death in the eye before and chosen to stare it down. Yet even they must have felt the weight of what was coming. The earth itself trembled beneath the approach of 60,000 enemy soldiers, a tide of steel and flesh that had swept across kingdoms and crushed armies many times their size. This was no ordinary battle. This was the kind of desperate stand that legends are born from, where ordinary men transcend their mortality to become something eternal, where the impossible becomes inevitable through sheer force of will, where courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm, even when fear threatens to paralyze the soul. What drives men to make such a choice? To plant their feet in the dirt and declare to an overwhelming enemy force that they shall not pass. History has given us glimpses into these moments of supreme sacrifice, these crucibles where human character is forged in the fires of desperate combat. Today we journey to one such moment, a mountain pass where geography, strategy, and raw human determination converged to create one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. The year was 1660, and the Indian subcontinent was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, sultanates, and emerging powers. In the rugged hills of the Western Ghats, a young Maratha king named Shivaji had been trapped for 5 long months inside the fortress of Panhala. His enemy, the powerful Bijapur Sultanate, had surrounded the fort with overwhelming force, determined to crush this upstart leader who dared challenge their authority. The siege had stretched through the monsoon season, and supplies within the fortress were running dangerously low. But Shivaji was not a man to accept defeat quietly. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a tactical genius who understood that sometimes the boldest move is the most unexpected one. In the darkest hour, when surrender seemed the only option,
not just bravery,
he conceived a plan so audacious that it would require the ultimate sacrifice from his most loyal followers. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, yet devastatingly complex in execution. Shivaji would break out of Panhala with 600 of his best warriors, racing across the treacherous mountain terrain toward the safety of Vishalgad fort. But between Panhala and Sanctuary lay a narrow mountain pass known as Ghod Khind, the Horse Pass. This defile, barely wide enough for a few men to fight abreast, would become the stage for an act of heroism so profound that it would echo through the centuries. As news of the breakout reached the enemy camp, the Bijapur forces mobilized with terrifying efficiency. Under the command of Siddhi Masood, a massive army of 12,000 cavalry thundered in pursuit. These were seasoned warriors, battle-hardened veterans of countless campaigns across the Deccan Plateau. Their horses were swift, their weapons sharp, and their numbers overwhelming. Against Shivaji's small force, they represented certain destruction if they could bring him to battle in open ground. But Shivaji had no intention of fighting in open ground. His strategy depended on reaching that narrow pass, that single point where geography could transform a hopeless retreat into a tactical masterpiece. The race was on, 600 Marathas against 12,000 pursuers, with the fate of an emerging empire hanging in the balance. Leading Shivaji's rearguard was a man whose name would be carved into the annals of military heroism. Baji Prabhu Deshpande was more than just a military commander. He was the embodiment of Maratha courage and loyalty. A veteran warrior who had fought beside Shivaji in countless skirmishes, he understood better than anyone what this moment demanded. When his king explained the desperate plan, Baji Prabhu accepted his role without hesitation,
I understand, my
knowing
king.
full well that it was a sentence of death. The arrangement was both brilliant and heartbreaking in its simplicity. Shivaji would take 300 men and race for Vishalgad, while Baji Prabhu would hold the pass with the remaining 300 warriors. The signal for success would be the sound of cannons fired from Vishalgad's walls, announcing the safe arrival of their king. Only when those distant guns echoed across the mountains would Baji Prabhu know that his sacrifice had achieved its purpose. As the Maratha force approached Ghod Khind, the magnitude of the undertaking became clear. The pass was a natural fortress, its rocky walls rising steeply on both sides, creating a bottleneck that would force the massive enemy army to attack in a narrow column. Here, the advantage of numbers would be neutralized, and 300 determined defenders could hold back thousands. But holding the pass meant dying in it. And every man in Baji Prabhu's force understood this grim arithmetic of sacrifice. The terrain itself seemed designed by fate for such a stand. The approach to the pass was treacherous, with loose rocks and steep slopes that would slow down cavalry and break up organized formations. Within the defile, the ground was uneven, creating natural defensive positions where small groups of men could maximize their effectiveness against larger forces. The narrowest point of the pass was barely 12 feet wide, meaning that no matter how many thousands approached, only a handful could actually engage the defenders at any given moment. As Shivaji disappeared into the distance with his 300 men, racing against time toward Vishalgad, Baji Prabhu began positioning his forces for the fight of their lives. These were not conscripts or mercenaries fighting for pay. These were men bound together by something far stronger than money or fear. They were brothers in arms, united by loyalty to their king and love for their homeland. Many had grown up together, trained together, fought together in dozens of smaller engagements. Now they would die together in defense of something greater than themselves. The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, echoing off the rocky walls of the pass like rolling thunder. Dust clouds rose in the distance, marking the advance of Siddhi Masood's cavalry. Soon, the first enemy scouts would crest the ridge and peer down into the pass, where 300 Maratha warriors waited with weapons drawn and hearts steeled for the ultimate test. What followed would transform a simple geographic feature into sacred ground, turning the horse pass into something that would forever after be known as Pavan Khind, the sacred pass. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable last stands, where impossible odds would meet unbreakable will, and where the echo of clashing steel would resonate through the centuries as a testament to human courage in its purest form. The first enemy scouts appeared on the ridge like harbingers of doom, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. They peered down into the narrow confines of Ghod Khind, and what they saw must have filled them with
Marathas are in formation.
300 men, arranged in tight formation across the width of the pass, their weapons glinting in the early light. To seasoned military minds, the mathematics seemed absurd. How could such a small force hope to delay, let alone stop, the massive army thundering toward them? But Baji Prabhu Deshpande was not thinking in terms of conventional warfare. He was orchestrating something far more profound, a symphony of sacrifice where every note would be played in blood and steel. His men took their positions with the calm precision of veterans who had accepted their fate. Spearmen formed the front rank, their long weapons creating a forest of deadly points. Behind them, swordsmen waited to fill any gaps that might appear. Archers found elevated positions among the rocks, their quivers full and their bowstrings taut. The roar of the approaching army grew deafening as Siddhi Masood's cavalry crested the final ridge. 12,000 horsemen spread across the landscape like a dark tide, their banners snapping in the wind, their war cries echoing off the mountains. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a display of raw military power that had crushed resistance across the length and breadth of the Deccan. These were the elite forces of the Bijapur Sultanate, men who had never known defeat, who had broken the will of countless enemies through sheer overwhelming force. Yet as they gazed down at the narrow pass, even the most confident among them must have felt a chill of recognition. They had seen defensive positions before, but rarely one so perfectly suited to the defenders. The pass was nature's own killing ground, a place where cavalry charges would be channeled into a meat grinder of spear points and sword blades. Still, their orders were clear. The Maratha king must not be allowed to escape, and this handful of defenders was all that stood between them and their quarry. Siddhi Masood deployed his forces with the methodical precision of an experienced commander. Wave after wave of cavalry would be sent into the pass, each assault designed to wear down the defenders until their line finally broke. Behind the first waves, fresh troops waited to exploit any breakthrough. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before, grinding down enemy resistance through sheer attrition. What the Bijapur commander could not have anticipated was the depth of resolve that awaited him in that narrow defile. The first charge began with the thunder of hooves on stone, hundreds of mounted warriors surging toward the pass entrance. They came with lances leveled, expecting to scatter the Maratha line like leaves before a hurricane. Instead, they met something that had become almost extinct in an age of gunpowder and politics, the ancient fury of warriors fighting for something beyond themselves. The clash, when it came, was like the sound of the world breaking apart. Horses reared and screamed as they impaled themselves on the hedge of Maratha spears. Riders tumbled from their saddles, crushed beneath the weight of their own mounts, or cut down by the flashing blades of defenders who seemed to be everywhere at once. The narrow confines of the pass became a charnel house, where the advantage of numbers meant nothing, where skill and determination counted for everything. Bodies began to pile up at the entrance, creating obstacles that made each successive charge more difficult than the last. But Baji Prabhu knew that this was only the beginning. Fresh waves of attackers pressed forward, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by the knowledge that their massive army could not be stopped by so few. Each assault was met with the same ferocious resistance, the same disciplined violence that turned the pass into an abattoir. Maratha warriors fell too, brave men who had given their lives to buy precious minutes for their escaping king. Yet their line held, bending but never breaking, absorbing each hammer blow and striking back with compound interest. Hours passed in a blur of combat so intense that time itself seemed to lose all meaning. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on men locked in mortal struggle, their armor slick with sweat and blood. The rocky walls of the pass echoed with the clash of steel on steel, the screams of the wounded, and the defiant war cries of defenders who refused to yield. With each passing moment, the pile of enemy dead grew higher, creating a grotesque monument to the price of trying to force this narrow passage. Siddhi Masood watched his casualties mount with growing frustration and grudging respect. His forces were taking losses at a rate that defied all military logic. For every Maratha warrior who fell, 10 of his own men paid the ultimate price. The narrow pass had become a funnel of death, channeling his overwhelming numerical advantage into a grinding stalemate where courage mattered more than numbers. Still, he pressed the assault, knowing that eventually, sheer weight of numbers must tell. The defenders fought with the desperate fury of men who knew that every moment they held the pass brought their king closer to safety. They rotated their fighters with practiced efficiency, bringing fresh men to the front as the wounded and exhausted fell back. But there was no real relief, no respite from the endless waves of attackers who kept coming like the tide itself. Each man knew that he was buying time with his life, trading his blood for the precious minutes that Shivaji needed to reach sanctuary. As the afternoon wore on, gaps began to appear in the Maratha line, not from cowardice or lack of will, but from the simple mathematics of attrition. Bodies can only endure so much, and even the bravest hearts eventually succumb to wounds and exhaustion. Yet each time a defender fell, his comrades closed ranks, maintaining the integrity of their formation through sheer force of will. They were no longer just holding a pass. They were defending the very idea that duty and honor could triumph over impossible odds. Baji Prabhu himself fought like a man possessed, his sword weaving patterns of death as he moved through the melee. Blood flowed from a dozen wounds, yet he seemed to draw strength from each injury, becoming more dangerous as he grew more desperate. His men looked to him for inspiration, and he did not disappoint them. Here was leadership in its purest form, not commanding from the rear, but standing in the front rank, where death was most likely to find him. The enemy dead now formed ramparts of their own, obstacles that forced the attackers to climb over the corpses of their comrades to reach the still defiant Marathas. The pass had become a landscape of horror, where the living fought among the dead, where every step forward cost dozens of lives. Yet still they came, wave after wave, driven by orders and the knowledge that their own survival might depend on breaking through this seemingly impossible defense. Then came the moment that every warrior in that blood-soaked pass had been waiting for. A distant boom echoed across the mountains, rolling through the valleys like the voice of the gods themselves. The cannon fire from Vishalgad. Shivaji had reached safety. The signal they had all been listening for, the sound that meant their sacrifice had not been in vain. But for Baji Prabhu Deshpande and his remaining men, this was not a signal to retreat. It was a signal that their duty was complete, that they could now die with the knowledge that their king lived to fight another day. The irony was not lost on these battle-hardened warriors. The sound of their salvation was also the sound of their doom, for they had no intention of abandoning their posts now that the mission was accomplished. Word spread through the Maratha ranks like wildfire. The cannons had spoken. Their lord was safe. What had begun as a desperate holding action had transformed into something else entirely, a final act of defiance that would echo through the ages. These men were no longer fighting to buy time. They were fighting to make a statement, to show the world that some things are worth dying for, that courage can shine brightest in the darkest hour. Siddhi Masood's forces sensed the change in their opponents. The Marathas fought now with a different kind of fury.
Victory!
The terrible joy of men who had completed their mission and were now free to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Every sword stroke carried the weight of finality. Every spear thrust was delivered with the knowledge that it might be the last. The pass rang with their war cries, ancient words that spoke of honor and homeland, of duty that transcended death itself. The Bijapur commander found himself in an impossible position. His orders had been simple enough: capture or kill the Maratha king. But Shivaji was now beyond his reach, safe behind the walls of Vishalgad. All he had accomplished was the destruction of thousands of his own men against a force that refused to break. The tactical situation had become a nightmare, with his cavalry being fed piecemeal into a killing ground that showed no mercy to numbers or reputation. As the shadows lengthened and the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the character of the battle shifted once more. The surviving Marathas, now fewer than 100, pulled back to the narrowest point of the pass. Here, where the rocky walls closed in like a vice, they made their final stand. Blood streamed from countless wounds. Their armor was dented and torn, their weapons chipped and stained, yet their eyes still burned with unquenchable fire. Baji Prabhu stood at the center of this last desperate circle, his sword arm heavy with exhaustion but his spirit unbroken. Around him, his remaining men formed a ring of steel and determination. They had no illusions about their fate. The mathematics were brutally clear, but mathematics had never been the point. This was about something that could not be measured in numbers or calculated in ledgers. This was about the moment when ordinary men become legends. The final assault came as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of crimson that seemed to mirror the blood that had been spilled in that narrow pass. Fresh troops, held in reserve throughout the day, now poured into the defile. They came not with the wild enthusiasm of the morning charges, but with the grim determination of professionals who understood that this last knot of resistance had to be cut. The end, when it came, was both swift and eternal. The small circle of Maratha warriors disappeared beneath a tide of steel and flesh, their defiant cries lost in the roar of combat. Yet even in death, they achieved something that transcended the moment. They had shown that 300 men, properly motivated and positioned, could exact a price so terrible that victory itself became a form of defeat. When the dust finally settled and the last echoes of combat faded from the mountain walls, Siddhi Masood surveyed a battlefield that told a story of courage so profound it defied comprehension. His army had won. Technically, the pass was his, but at what cost? Thousands of his finest warriors lay dead or dying among the rocks. His cavalry, the pride of the Bijapur Sultanate, had been decimated, and the man he had been sent to capture was now safely beyond his reach. The transformation of Ghod Khind into Pavan Khind was more than just a change of name. It was recognition that something sacred had occurred here, something that elevated mere geography into the realm of the divine.
And
The
then
pass had been
the
baptized in
mighty
blood and
Baji
sacrifice,
Prabhu and his
consecrated by
300
acts of
warriors
heroism
stood
that would be
firm,
remembered long
a
after the
wall
names
of
of kings
courage
and
against the
empires were
enemy.
forgotten. But the impact of this impossible stand reached far beyond the immediate tactical situation. News of the battle spread like wildfire across the Maratha territories, carried by bards and storytellers who understood that they were witnessing the birth of a legend. Here was proof that the new power rising in the hills could not be easily crushed, that its warriors possessed something that mere numbers could not overcome. For Shivaji, safe behind the walls of Vishalgad, the sound of those distant cannons carried a weight that only a true leader could understand. 300 of his finest men had died to ensure his survival, had chosen death over retreat, had transformed a military necessity into an act of supreme sacrifice. The debt he owed to Baji Prabhu and his warriors could never be repaid, only honored through the creation of something worthy of their sacrifice. The strategic implications
We must
of the
proceed
stand
with
at
extreme
Pavan Khind
caution through these
rippled
passes.
outward, like
Their
stones
resolve
thrown
is
into
stronger
still
than we
water.
anticipate.
The Bijapur Sultanate had learned a harsh lesson about the cost of pursuing Maratha forces into their mountain strongholds.
The
Future
terrain was
campaigns would be
treacherous,
planned with
a
greater
narrow
caution,
pass.
knowing that
Any
every
misstep
pass
would
and
have been
valley might
catastrophic.
conceal another group of
We must
warriors
learn
willing to
from
die
these
for their
movements.
cause. The
This flanking
psychological
maneuver
impact
is
was
crucial.
perhaps even more
Critical.
significant than the
But
military
it leaves
one.
our left.
Word of the battle reached courts and camps across the subcontinent, where military commanders studied the tactical lessons with professional interest. How had 300 men held off 12,000 for so long? What combination of terrain, morale, and leadership had made such a feat possible? The answers would influence military
We
thinking for
stand as
generations
one,
to come,
united
as generals
in
learned to
our
respect
purpose.
the power of determined defenders in favorable ground.
In the
Yet
heart
the
of
true
the night,
legacy of
a
Pavan Khind
tale of valor
lay not in its
unfolds,
tactical
a
innovations but
testament
in
to the
its
brave
spiritual
warriors of
significance.
Pavan Khind.
The battle became a touchstone for Maratha identity, a defining moment that crystallized what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. In the villages and towns where Maratha power was taking root, the story was told and retold, each telling adding new layers of meaning and inspiration. The transformation of 300 mortal men into immortal legend had begun. Their names would be carved in stone and sung in ballads. Their courage would inspire countless others to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. They had achieved something that few warriors in history can claim. They had turned certain defeat into eternal victory through the simple act of refusing to yield. In the mountain pass that would forever bear the name Sacred Pass, the wind still whispers through the rocks where heroes made their stand. The physical evidence of that terrible day has long since been reclaimed by time and weather, but the spiritual resonance remains. This is hallowed ground, where the impossible became inevitable through sheer force of human will. The echoes of that day at Pavan Khind would reverberate far beyond the blood-soaked stones of the mountain pass. In the
And
weeks
in
that
that
followed,
desperate
as
moment,
news of the impossible stand spread
300
across the
brave
Deccan
warriors
plateau,
stood
something
as
profound
one.
began to shift in the collective consciousness of the Maratha people.
And
What had
thus,
begun as a
the
desperate
brave
military
warriors of
maneuver
Maratha
had
stood
transformed
united,
into something far
their
more
spirit
powerful,
unyielding,
a rallying
their
cry
resolve
that would unite
unbreakable.
scattered hill tribes and fortress garrisons under a common banner of resistance. From village to village, the tale grew in the telling. Bards and storytellers, those keepers of memory who weave fact into legend, carried the story of 300 warriors who chose death over dishonor. In market squares and temple courtyards, crowds gathered to hear how ordinary men had become something extraordinary, how courage had triumphed over calculation, how the narrow walls of a mountain pass had contained heroism so pure it seemed to touch the divine itself.
We
The
fight
psychological
on for our
impact on the
homeland.
Maratha
Our
forces
spirit is
was
renewed
immediate
by their
and electric.
sacrifice.
Young warriors who had never seen battle began to speak of earning their place beside Baji Prabhu's immortal 300. Veterans who had grown weary of endless skirmishes found their spirits rekindled by the knowledge that their cause could inspire such sacrifice. The very idea of retreat became not just tactically unthinkable but spiritually impossible. How could men flee when their comrades had shown that standing firm could transform defeat into eternal victory? The Battle of Pavan Khind stands as a testament to a simple yet profound truth that echoes across the centuries. Numbers alone do not determine the outcome of history's most crucial moments. When 300 warriors chose to plant their feet in that narrow mountain pass, they were making a declaration that reverberates still. They declared that some causes transcend the mathematics of survival, that honor weighs heavier than odds, and that the human spirit, when properly forged, can bend the very arc of destiny itself. In that blood-soaked defile, where the impossible became inevitable, ordinary men discovered they possessed something far more powerful than superior numbers. They possessed the unshakable conviction that their sacrifice mattered,